the Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need, the sun and rain and an apple seed. Yes, he's been good to me. I owe the Lord so much for everything I see. I'm certain if it weren't for him, there'd be no apples on this limb. He's been good to me. Oh, here am I, 'neath the blue, blue sky, a-doing as I please, singing with my feathered friends, sawing with the bees. I wake up every day as happy as can be, because I know that with his care my apple trees, they will still be there. Oh, the Lord is good to me.
Walt Disney's 1948 The Legend of Johnny Appleseed presents John Chapman as a devout Christian, but the film does not say what kind of Christian he was. Popularizing the mythic Appleseed, poet Vachel Lindsay called Chapman, quote, a New England kind of saint. Yet, as we have observed in our essay series on the long influence of Emanuel Swedenborg, Chapman was a missionary of the new church inspired by that European theosophist and polymath. Thus, a figure of early American folklore became a personal node of transmission for Swedenborg's ideas on the Ohio frontier, spreading those beliefs into the new country along with his apple trees. Chapman became famous for working character, ascetic frugality, and planting trees from seed. Along with apples, however, he planted the seeds of belief in extraterrestrial contact in the emerging United States, where it eventually grew into the weird fruit of flying saucers. I have now read William Kerrigan's excellent 2012 work, Johnny Appleseed and the American Orchard, A Cultural History. Per the title, Kerrigan includes the spiritual biography of Chapman to help fill out our previous sketchy reference. After walking across the Allegheny Mountains to western Pennsylvania in 1797, an economic refugee from Massachusetts, Chapman stopped at a land company store in Brokenstraw, where the surviving ledger shows that he purchased, quote, 2 small histories that were the only books, save a few Bibles, sold to any customer at this primitive outpost in the last 5 years of the 18th century, Kerrigan writes. Thus, Chapman was no simpleton or rube at all. On the contrary, to become a rigid Swedenborgian, as he was known to be, required intellectual endeavor, for true conviction emerged gradually through careful reading and contemplation. A spiritual seeker had to do the work reading Swedenborg, and Chapman seems to have earned his reputation for hard work. Not all of the Appleseed legend survives scrutiny. Most of the entries in the ledger suggest John Chapman was not so different from his frontier neighbors, and undermine the static myth of Johnny Appleseed as a barefoot, clean-living vegetarian who never carried a gun, Kerrigan writes. Among the items he purchased upon arriving at Brokenstraw were, quote, brandy, whiskey, tobacco, pork, chocolate, sugar, gunpowder, and several pairs of moccasins. Chapman dabbled in land speculation, paid his bills with and bartered with apple tree seedlings, and died in debt. He was no monk. He was an all-American man on the make, eccentric but earnest. Chapman carried Swedenborg's writings with him as he traveled between his hidden nurseries, unthreading the volumes of collected translations printed in Philadelphia by a friend of Benjamin Franklin, and left portions of these collected works with his many hosts along the road, swapping them for new selections as he came around again. Thus, Chapman would have passed out copies of Other Worlds, the book which taught Americans to believe that people live on alien planets. It is a certainty that Chapman read Other Worlds. A voracious reader of theology, Chapman could explain the minutest differences between Protestant theologians and define every church by its doctrine, often at great length, to the excitement of many and the boredom of others. Quote, the ministers and other deeply religious people he encountered had great respect for his intellect, even when they rejected his beliefs. Given his simple education and his primitive lifestyle, it would be easy to assume that Chapman became drawn in by Swedenborg's vivid descriptions of the afterlife and had only a limited grasp of his theology. But the evidence suggests John's attachment to New Church theology went deeper than just that. He understood even the finer theological distinctions that separated Methodists, Quakers, Universalists, New Churchmen, and others. Moreover, Swedenborg's stories of his conversations with angels and his visits to heaven were not the first John Chapman had encountered either. Contrary to the image of a white settler clearing the land with a gun and a Bible, the open frontier was a cultural estuary where native folkways and colonial religion met and mixed. Chapman encountered full-grown orchards belonging to Native Americans who had adopted European apples decades before his arrival. He wore snowshoes, a Native American invention, to cross the frontier in winter so that he could plant in spring. Kerrigan questions the true depth of Chapman's real contacts with Native Americans, but points out that Chapman entered a world half built of native cultural materials. He surely heard the stories of the prophet Handsome Lake's travels to the spirit world when he was living just a few miles away from his village of Burnt House in northwestern Pennsylvania, Kerrigan writes. Those stories, in fact, had many similarities to Swedenborg's, pointing towards that writer's theosophy. And the spiritual visions of Tenskwatawa and the story of how he predicted a solar eclipse were well known in the settlements along Owl Creek and the forks of the Mohican. Furthermore, the Trans-Appalachian frontier in the first decades of the 19th century was crawling with would-be prophets. Some, like the Leatherword God of Guernsey County, Ohio, claimed to be God in person. That John Chapman became drawn into Swedenborg's heavenly visions made him neither particularly gullible nor insane, as some have suggested. He was in good company. Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville noted that forms of religious madness were very common on the American frontier. Benjamin Franklin was among the first subscribers to the translated works of Swedenborg printed in America, an expression of elite interest in a new church in the early United States. Swedenborg thus informed high and low culture in the new nation. It was through the transatlantic Anglophone elite that the iconic image of Chapman crossed back over the ocean dressed as the barefoot saint in rags during his own lifetime. A Swedenborg reading group in Manchester, England, received a letter from its satellite organization in Philadelphia during 1817, remarking on, quote, a very extraordinary missionary of the New Jerusalem. A man has appeared who seems to be almost independent of corporal wants and sufferings. He goes barefooted, can sleep anywhere in house or out of house, and lives upon the coarsest and most scanty fare. He has actually thawed the ice with his bare feet. He procures what books he can of the new church, travels into remote settlements and lends them wherever he can find readers, and sometimes divides a book into 2 or 3 parts for more extensive distribution and usefulness. This man, for years past, has been in the employment of bringing into cultivation, in numberless places in the wilderness, small patches, 2 or 3 acres of ground, and then sowing apple seeds and rearing nurseries. These become valuable as the settlements approximate, and the profits of the whole are intended for the purpose of enabling him to print all the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg and distribute them through the western settlements of the United States. Raising apples from seed had economic advantages for settlers on the frontier. First, it was easier to carry seeds than grafted trees. Any apples that survived in any single patch would already be adapted to the local microclimate. Sooner or later, frontier families would crave something sweet. It was a rational plan that did not always survive contact with the community. Chapman was criticized for failing to protect some of his orchards with adequate brushwood fencing, so deer allegedly ate into his profits. As the frontier filled up fast with people and land purchasers, some of his orchards ended up in the hands of strangers. Nonviolent to a fault, Chapman would seek local contacts to befriend and persuade the new landowner into letting him take some number of trees. What he lost in his search for landed income was therefore never quite made up by selling apple trees in the end, for his debts were greater than his assets when his will finally probated a decade after his death. Apples were simply too marginal and too low class in the emerging American hierarchy for Johnny Appleseed to die rich. It did not help that he was always so generous, again, to a fault. Chapman wore public thrift as a sort of armor against poverty. His choices of paladin clothing, both fabric and fit, drew attention with their clean but worn and patchwork construction. He ate simple, cheap foods, and likely hunted meat in his early years. This, too, was seen as a lower class economic activity. "Hunters never grow rich," Kerrigan quotes a contemporary critic of the frontiersman. "He who depends on the forest for his meat from year to year ought not to be enrolled as a citizen." Kerrigan ascribes, quote, "the image of Johnny Appleseed as frontiersman who rejected hunting to, quote, historic American ambivalence to the activity, from Crevecoeur's time down to our own. From its inception, the Johnny Appleseed story has served, in many ways, as a countermyth to the legend of hunters like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. That is, Johnny Appleseed, the American saint, the Swedenborg sanitized John Chapman, has always been a countercultural figure. By 1822, the Cincinnati New Church was the center of communications for other Swedenborgians in the West, we learn. Quote, that same year, the group took a turn toward anti-clericalism, an increasingly common phenomenon in American churches in this democratic age. Intuitional religion was rejecting institutional religion. The eternal crisis of American spirituality had begun. For, quote, in this age of expanding individualism, even choosing the tiny new church was an act that suggested a predilection toward independent-mindedness, Kerrigan says. Quote, John Chapman may not have been a typical Swedenborgian, but the group did seem to attract people ready to break from the social expectations of the wider society. Chapman's economic strategy, quote, of planting large numbers of trees from seed scattered across the landscape in hidden nurseries, resonates with hippies planting wild marijuana patches, likewise near water. A risky but sensible plan to escape taxation. Indeed, the real Johnny Appleseed, at least according to Kerrigan, rather resonates with the poetic career of Steve Earle's grandfather in Copperhead Road. For the most common purpose of raising apples was to make hard cider. Cider was a sweet beverage that could also induce happy intoxication. Again, for the elites coming west, cider became a low-status drink, and so did seedling apple trees, which were, quote, at various times associated with the poor, the idle, the unambitious, the primitive frontier family eking out a subsistence, those who sought isolation from markets, the common southerner, and the cider drinker. Right as the temperance movement, another manifestation of American religious fervor, began to agitate against intoxicating drink. Grafted apple trees were associated with the man of capital, the industrious, the striver, the gentleman farmer, the improver, the Yankee, and the teetotaler. Kerrigan says that is industry. Nevertheless, Yankee industry was at the core of Chapman's apple strategy. Cider trees turned marginal lands, such as the rocky clay soils of his youth, into a replacement for beer, reducing consumption of the grains that they grew on their better fields. Geography ruled these economic terms. Quote, the result was a dramatic increase in cider production in the early 18th century, Kerrigan explains. Massachusetts even exported cider to the West Indies, so abundant was the harvest. Quote, one village of 40 families produced almost 3,000 barrels of cider in a year. Another village of 200 families produced almost 10,000 barrels, or roughly 50 to 75 barrels per family annually. 18th century tax valuations often undercounted these orchards, even as cider production was increasing. This was in part because of the hidden nature of New England's orchards. Tax assessors often failed to count apple trees randomly scattered throughout a pasture or small aggregations of trees clustered on a rocky hillside. Yet these unnoticed, diffused, decentralized orchards provided large quantities of fruit each fall for the cider mills. These apples, probably the ones Chapman ate first in life, were themselves, quote, for the most part seeding stock that had crossed the Atlantic. They were, quote, typically small, crabbed, and bitter, with the waste remnants of the cider-making process consumed by hogs, again a lower-class animal. Thus, Chapman was developing a marginal economic niche from the beginning, one wholly associated with the post-Revolutionary War generation of New Englanders who found themselves marginalized by the emerging economy of the new nation and sought to scratch out new modes of self-sustainment on the frontier, free of taxes. Kerrigan notes the doctrine of correspondences in Swedenborg's writing, a mark of the influence of Hermeticism and the alchemists, as above, so below, as below, so above. It remains unclear that Chapman was even aware of these intellectual roots, let alone read or understood them, yet he would have transmitted the ideas nonetheless. Over time, American Swedenborgians trended towards utopianism and Gnostic criticism of a corrupted world. In 1822, for example, a Universalist writer called Swedenborg insane, but noted that his followers displayed, quote, none of the cant, none of the moroseness, none of the affected airs of superiority which distinguish the real true blue orthodox. They can all enjoy the good things of life without murmuring and muttering and making long faces. And if they have a dash of the ludicrous now and then in divine human metaphysic long lucubrations, ascending in giddy heights through many heavens, it is not to be wondered at, considering the daring heights to which they presume as earthly guests, thinking themselves inspired with true imperial air. Swedenborg did not deny himself material comforts, and he rejected the idea that a good Christian needed to live an ascetic life, Kerrigan writes. At the same time that the Universalist writer was reacting to Swedenborgians, William Metcalf, a Swedenborgian, was inventing American vegetarianism in Philadelphia, which was still the American metropole. Chapman's reputation as a vegetarian may therefore be true, though it would have come as a change later in his career and only after being convinced by reading Metcalf's tracts. Chapman's real or imagined eccentricities were therefore, quote, an extreme manifestation of this larger trend in the American New Church, away from Swedenborg's defense of marriage and earthly enjoyment, towards a rejection of materialism, much as the European writers reacting to Swedenborg trended towards neo-Gnosticism. Chapman's dedication to the transmigration of his soul through many heavens, because Swedenborg's heaven consisted of multiple heavens, all located in the physical heavens, shaped his own beliefs about marriage. His prophet offered, quote, highly idealized visions of a perfect marriage in heaven, with a soulmate who might not be the same as one's earthly partner. Kerrigan finds this not surprising, because, quote, we know of his own infatuation with a married woman, the Countess Gyllenborg. In one of Swedenborg's visions, it is revealed to him that the Countess is his true soulmate, the person he will spend eternity with, and her earthly husband, Baron Frederick Gyllenborg, appears in heaven briefly in the body of a cat, the form often taken by the morally inferior, before he decides to dwell in hell forever. In this respect, Chapman would not have stood out as a missionary. Quote, it was not unusual for religious evangelizers in the early 19th century to remain bachelors, Kerrigan writes. Quote, in fact, bachelorhood had been the common state of most of the early Methodist circuit-riding preachers. The pay was so low and the conditions so rough that the church discouraged marriage. Marriage also had economic consequences. Men who married tended to settle and become landowners, whereas Chapman was still a wandering spirit even late in life. Rosella Rice, who knew and admired Chapman, recalled that, quote, he liked women better than men. He seemed feminine in many of his attributes, and in his likes and dislikes he was decidedly womanish. Lest we draw too much postmodern meaning from this description, Chapman's reputation for gentleness did not extend to his own flesh. Quote, when Chapman arrived at a pioneer home, Rosella recalled, he seemed instantly attracted to the company of women and eager to learn about the development of each child since his last appearance. All of these factors combined, his peculiar habits, his womanish traits, the frozen image of his mother as the perfect woman, and the idealization of the marriage bond encouraged in New Church writings, may have made the odds of John finding a partner in this world too long. Rice, who knew him when she was a little girl, claimed that he, quote, gloried in suffering, and that, quote, if he had a cut or sore, the first thing he did was to sear it with a red-hot iron and then treat it as a burn. He was also known, quote, to thrust pins and needles into his flesh without a tremor, to demonstrate to admiring children, perhaps, his ability to endure pain. End quote. Rewards in heaven awaited him, so Johnny Appleseed never married. He practiced sanctified self-harm to save his soul for the perfect soulmate who would be assigned to him in heaven, a life spent preparing for the next life. Reading Kerrigan's text suggests another possibility, however. Either he does not recognize the signs of autism, or does not care to invite controversy by suggesting the possibility that Jonathan Chapman was autistic. Sensory issues with the fit of his clothing may explain the coarse tow linen coat he designed, which his mother made, and an eyewitness described as descending, quote, from his neck to his heels. It was without collar. In this robe were cut 2 armholes, into which were placed 2 straight sleeves. Chapman's myth includes melting ice with his feet, as well as outdoor work in freezing conditions with no coat at all. This writer was reminded of a rather autistic boy in high school who refused to wear a jacket in freezing weather because his body ran so hot. Chapman's obsessive completeness of knowledge regarding an obscure topic, Swedenborg's writings, makes sense as a possible symptom. We shall never know the answer, but the question mark deserves to stand up and be seen. Despite being, quote, Central Ohio's most enthusiastic new church evangelizer, his method of splitting up Swedenborg's texts was, quote, unlikely to win many converts, as understanding new church doctrines was challenging enough when read in the intended order, Kerrigan writes. Nevertheless, Swedenborg's impact on American religion in the 19th century would be profound, helping to inspire Mormon religion, spiritualism, and then the Church of Theosophy in turn, all of them believing in the existence of aliens on alien worlds and alien souls in alien heavens because of the Swedish prophet. During Chapman's old age, Ohio itself had changed, becoming more metropolitan and prosperous. Improved transportation and an influx of capital had lifted the more successful residents of north-central Ohio out of the barefoot homemade cider and log cabin days into a more comfortable existence, Kerrigan observes. Quote, most welcomed these changes enthusiastically, but with all change came reflection on what had been lost. Preachers, especially, worried that the new comforts threatened to undermine the spiritual convictions of their flocks, and returned to the theme with a tiresome regularity. We may therefore regard the apparent asceticism of the primitive Christian Johnny Appleseed as a manifestation of desire for heaven in the face of rapid economic change, as the boom and bust cycle of America's 19th century emerged in the first national bank crisis. A self-denying Swedenborgianism offered spiritual salvation to those who pursued landed wealth, such as Chapman, especially when their speculations failed, as his most often did. The one thing Swedenborg did not seem to influence in Chapman was his apple-raising methods. Quote, some chroniclers wrongly suggested that Chapman's alleged aversion to grafting apple trees came from Swedenborgian beliefs, Kerrigan explains. In fact, Swedenborg himself grafted apples in his own orchard, and never suggested that grafting violated God's laws. It was the famous 1871 Harper's Monthly Magazine article by W.D. Haley which, quote, helped to spread the notion that Chapman's aversion to grafting was based on irrational superstition, by asserting that John denounced as absolute wickedness all devices of pruning and grafting, and would speak of the act of cutting a tree as if it were a cruelty inflicted upon a sentient being. Kerrigan blames the forward march of progress. Quote, by the year the Harper's article was released, grafting was so universally embraced by orchard keepers that many had forgotten why any rational person might choose to plant apples from seed. Nor would Americans recall when Christian theosophists began encountering, quote, men from Venus, who stepped out of flying saucers just over a century after his death in 1845, that Johnny Appleseed had helped plant seeds of faith in the existence of extraterrestrial beings across America. Disney revived the legend of Johnny Appleseed in the throes of the early Cold War, a time of increasing global tension and World War II exhaustion. Disney's Appleseed carries a Bible, but Swedenborg is unmentioned. At the time, America needed a saint to embody its own best self-image of simple goodness in a complicated world. The Disney Appleseed overcomes the resistance of frontier critters to his landscape improvements through nonviolent goodness and charitable goodwill instead of plow and gun. He becomes the perfect Appleseed to found the United Nations, an explicitly theosophical organization in hopes of preserving a Christian world peace. We shall return to this theme in a future essay.